know that. There's enough in this report, and it's devastating. There's enough in this report, Juju, to really tell us what we've got as the remaining question, and that is why.
And so why is the haunting question?
Again, this, for any experienced pilot, there's no question in your mind what's going to happen if you turn these off. So the question in my mind is, was this some sort of mental aberration, or was this purposeful?
We don't know who is talking to whom at this stage of the game. They haven't released that. But one of the pilots says to the other, "Why did you just do that?" So again, that points toward some sort of deliberate action, and for some reason, no recognition of the fact of what just happened.
So the question in my mind is, was this some sort of mental aberration, or was this purposeful?
So in other words, was this, in your expert opinion, some sort of mass murder?
Mass murder is among the most heinous acts in which humans engage. 260 people died in this incident, 241 on the plane and 19 on the ground. There were also an additional 67 seriously injured on the ground. The worst mass killing in America occurred in Las Vegas, where 58 were killed and around 500 injured when a 64-year-old gunman opened fire from an elevated hotel room and mowed down a crowd attending a concert below. This Air India incident, if it was intentional, would make it worse almost by a factor of 4.5 to America's worst mass murder. I mean, just imagine that. If it is true, if one person possibly is responsible for the deaths of 259 others, what are these mass murderers thinking?
What were you thinking?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is a true crime channel, and we typically deal with 1 or 2 murders in a particular case, very occasionally more than that. The Brian Koberger case in Idaho, Moscow is unusual in that there we have 4 victims. In the Air India case, if we are dealing with mass murder, we're not dealing with 5 more or 10 more or 20 more. We are dealing with hundreds more. The literature is quite clear. There is actually a psychological profile, in a sense, for mass murderers. When I wrote the book Slaughter, a book profiling some of the worst mass shooters, it was also one of the hardest books I've ever written. I was astonished at how similar the profiles of each perpetrator was. In this analysis, we'll examine the hypothesis that one of the Air India pilots did deliberately sabotage the flight. Did you notice I used the word hypothesis? I don't normally speculate in terms of the entire video, but this is what we are doing in this video. If he did so, what was he thinking? Why? Why take so many innocent people with him? And notice the word if. Unfortunately, there are answers to these seemingly unfathomable questions in the literature about human nature, and we're going to be dealing with them in a moment. Before we get to that, let's have a look at what the word hypothetical means.
Hypothetical.
It means that we are testing a suggested idea or theory. It means our conjecture is along a hypothetical argument. Now, for those who don't want to think about this possibility, put up your hands. If you cannot abide even the idea of a hypothesis, now might be a good time to stop this video and head for the nearest exit. By the way, try not to let the door hit you on the way out.
Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out.
For those who are still watching, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, and we are going into some very admittedly dark places, please do hit the thanks button and let's get started.
Society, but as you're indicating, when it comes to pilots, by nature of their job, they have so many people's lives in their hands. What is the screening, mental health-wise, for pilots? And do the people that you've been talking with believe that it is enough?
Well, it's interesting, William, because the pilot who's flying your airliner has a physical exam every 6 months, but there is no specific psychological evaluation. The doctors say, "Hey, how you feeling? You depressed?" And they say, "I'm fine."
First off, if you think the mental state of pilots is not only irrelevant here, but generally irrelevant, a 2016 study of almost 2,000 airline pilots, this is actually pretty shocking, found that over 12% had depression. That's more than 1 in 10 pilots. And 4.1% reported having thoughts about wanting to end their lives. That's about 1 in 20 in the previous 2 weeks. This suggests a significant prevalence of serious mental health issues, if you ask me. By the way, thanks to Cosmos Chill for bringing this study to my attention. Incidentally, the idea for the study came about, the 2016 study, because of the German wings incident a year earlier in 2015. Someone literally noted that incident and said, perhaps we need to think about this. Perhaps we need to do a study. Perhaps we need to determine whether psychological health is a problem. Do you think it was wrong for them to be open to the idea, this hypothesis of simply examining a problem? Even more troubling, this same study highlighted why pilots would not try to seek help. Clearly, if they did, this would impact their career prospects. This is a real barrier in terms of knowing the true state of the psychological malaise affecting pilots. According to Psychology Today, from 2014 to 2021, there were 3,388 mass shootings, according to the Gun Violence Archive. In 2022 alone, that's 3 years ago, from January to mid-June, that's a little bit less than where we are now this year, there were 267 mass shooting events. Now, what I am doing is conflating what happened in the Air India thing with the idea, with a general scenario of a mass murder scenario. It's comparing one mass murder to another. The one is using obviously a firearm, the other something else. Mass shootings raise questions about the psychology of violence, the emotional aftermath for those affected and the broader public, child development and parenting approaches, and how to move through a world in which these atrocities occur over and over again. Now we're going to look at 7 terrifying everyday factors associated with mass murder. What is really scary about this is you tend to think that if this takes place, it is so unfathomable that there's no way you could possibly understand it. And yet it turns out that it is very, very ordinary things that are really building up and accumulating that someone has failed to manage. Anyway, let's go through them one by one. Number 1, psychosis. Where there is a mass murder, there is psychosis. Psychosis, for the uninitiated, is a mental state where a person loses touch with reality. They live effectively in a dream world. This state is a necessary precondition for these ghastly human atrocities, losing touch with reality. So be very careful if you are losing touch with reality. Be very careful if someone around you is losing touch with reality as well. And how does one lose touch with reality? Well, through very ordinary things such as sleep deprivation, repeated drug use, addiction, fantasies, but also isolation for a length of time, and perhaps even the use of prescription medication, including to some extent antidepressants, sleeping pills, just lots of medication. It's not necessarily being on that medication, but sometimes coming off it as well. It is just any circumstance or scenario that starts to alter your sense of reality. One of those could be watching a lot of movies, or reading a lot of a certain kind of book, or spending too much time on social media in those echo chambers. In a very general sense, we can take care of ourselves and our fellow man by making sure we or they are grounded in reality. That happens to be a major mission of this channel, to show people what reality is. Not trying to be popular, not trying to tell people what they want to hear, not even to be sensational, but to teach discernment, to say what actually happened here, an accident or foul play. What is the real situation here? And this channel is not only about what reality is, but what it is not, telling the difference. And it's to a very large extent that in this area, this channel works a lot harder than other channels. But back to psychosis, how do we define it? It's a mental state where a person loses touch with reality, and symptoms of psychosis are hallucinations, delusions, a collection of symptoms that can be caused by various factors and can, of course, be aggravated by substance abuse, right? Coming back to Psychology Today, a study published in the journal Psychology, Public Policy and Law examined the mental health histories of 176 mass shooters between 1966 and 2020. The research showed that psychosis was deemed to have played a major role in 11% of shootings, a moderate role in 9% of cases, and a minor role in 11% of cases. So psychosis was prevalent in some way in around a third of all of these mass shooting cases. That's quite a lot. The role of psychosis in mass shootings has been relatively stable over time, even as the number of mass shootings has risen sharply in the past few years. And so it does seem as though losing touch with reality is something we need to pay attention to. So one of the first questions we ought to ask in terms of this Air India case was whether the Air India pilot was suffering from psychosis. Was he losing track with reality? Did losing a parent and having to care for another affect his sense of reality? Did the fact that he was going to give up a job that he'd been doing for 37 years affect his sense of reality? According to the article, the results indicate that while mental illness is often blamed for the recent rise in mass shootings, psychosis alone doesn't appear to be the most significant factor. So what is? And that brings us to number 2, vengeance. Psychosis alone doesn't explain these horrendous incidents. One aspect that seems to be part and parcel of the pathopsychology are feelings of revenge, of wanting to get payback against society because of a perceived sense that society has hurt them or punished them or been unfair to them. That is certainly something that appears to be the case in the Idaho 4 quadruple murders, but I would also hazard to say it might be present in the Laurie Vallow case to some extent as well. One can see how the beliefs of the individual as well as delusions can fuel these feelings, especially if the individual is losing touch with reality as well as stress. Coming back to Psychology Today, mass murder is frequently an act of vengeance against society committed by a desperate and fatalistic individual who has no intention of going away quietly. And the fact that these individuals often take their own lives, I think that is often missed. In the whole catastrophe that happens, people forget that this is someone who's actually taking their own life. And anyone in that situation, if you just saw it as that, only that is a very desperate, fatalistic, unhappy person, someone who doesn't want to live. Now again, one has to ponder, if this was an intentional act by a depressed pilot, what was he so depressed about? Number 3, psychopathy. Besides psychosis, which is losing touch with reality, psychopathy is also a factor, which is where an ordinary person starts to feel, amongst other things, less empathy for his fellow man. He starts to feel a little antisocial. Do you see it's a process of unraveling, of caring less and less? And there's some hope in that. If it's a process, it means it's a process that can also be reversed. It's a pattern that can be recognized. Now, according to Psychology Today, quote, researchers performed a meta-analysis of 22 studies of more than 2,600 homicide offenders in 6 countries, in which each offender's psychopathy score was assessed. They found that the average psychopathy scale score for someone who had committed murder was 21.1. The average score in the general non-offender population is 4 or 5. This means that all the offenders were at least somewhat higher than the community average, and that most murderers studied could be considered at least moderately psychopathic. This would necessarily include mass murderers. Number 4, deeply disgruntled. It may not make sense that a psychopathic person has feelings, but they do. On the one hand, they are feeling raw about something.
grow up, if you still feel raw about it, I'll be waiting.
On the other hand, their feelings connecting them to others have been or is being eroded. Does that make sense? So you have someone who has very strong feelings in one area and very much weakened feelings in other areas, especially just in general how they are connected to other people. According to one study, mass murder is associated with disgruntled individuals, those who feel their lives have not met their own expectations. In other words, there's a much larger narrative at work here, where an individual feels who they are is in a sense of failure. A lot of what is going on is a person speaking to themselves, counseling themselves, telling a story to themselves, which is kind of incontrovertible in their minds. And that story then is a sort of like a curse. It's something they can't get out of. They can't seem to counter it. And all of this, the sense of failure, might be due to issues at work, the inability to find a mate, or the failure to find a basic level of happiness in life in general, or in all of these areas. Mass shootings that occur in public locations are usually committed by deeply disgruntled individuals who are seeking revenge as a motive for failures in school, career, romance, or life in general. And that brings us to number 5, mental illness. Almost all mass murderers have mental illness, for example, depression. In a study of 171 mass shooters these are people who attacked the United States from 1966 to 2019. Researchers Adam Langford and Rebecca Cohen found that although the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent, almost all public mass shooters may have mental health problems. They suggest the frequency of mental health problems among mass shooters is sometimes underestimated because many perpetrators have never been formally evaluated by a psychiatrist or mental health practitioner, and others deliberately avoid doctors, conceal their mental health problems, or lie about their symptoms due to shame, stigma, or fear of other consequences. The concealing of mental health problems does seem as if it could be a real factor here, even though there is some evidence to show they were present regardless. Also, there appears to be a real stigma not only in India in terms of this area, but in the operative profession we are dealing with as well. Langford and Cohen also emphasized that mental illness is not the sole cause of mass shootings, and many other factors play an important role in the perpetrator's decision to attack. Now, obviously, once again, when we talk about mass shootings, we're basically talking about mass murder as an analogy to what happened potentially, possibly, in the Air India thing incident. And we're basically asking, is it similar? Does it seem like there's a similar fabric here? It's an open question. Number 6, feelings of isolation. How does one develop feelings of depression? How does one develop feelings of losing touch with reality? How does one develop feelings of vengeance and the rest? It's probably difficult to do that if one remains part of a close-knit family or community. And I suppose a big question to ask is if something like that happened here, is the reason that this person has been taken away from his family when they needed him, or is he being taken away from the close-knit pilot community, or is it both, that he's feeling kind of lost, not quite sure where he belongs? Perhaps he's getting pressure from both sides, pressure from the one side to work and pressure from the other side to be a supportive son. According to Wikipedia, criminologist James Allen Fox contends that mass murders are enabled by social isolation and typically experience years of disappointment and failure that produce a mix of profound hopelessness and deep-seated resentment. Number 7, impulsivity. Although mass murder is seldom impulsive in and of itself, because there is a long, burdensome backstory leading up to the event, there's also planning and premeditation. The root cause of the action may ultimately be a lack of impulse control. A sea of emotions that has been steaming and stewing for ages can ultimately overwhelm the reason that would otherwise prevent or control these actions. At the time that these mass murders take place, the mental illness literally takes control of the situation. The sick mind takes over. For me, this is the biggest insight. And it is a warning that if you're becoming more impulsive in a certain way, in terms of your habits, in certain things that you're doing, be careful. If you notice someone being more impulsive, take note. Now, although the fabric of the malaise is there, the unhappiness, the hopelessness, the frustration, the depression, the losing touch with reality, the stress, the fatigue, the onset of psychopathy, where all of these stresses combine, what basically happens is it makes the person simply care less. It makes the person simply more reckless. And it's within this increasingly unbearable milieu that I think the individual becomes impulsive. It's almost like they become so desperate, they just want some way just to stop this terrible, untenable situation. Think about it. Happy, psychologically strong people are strong in self-discipline. Depressed, mentally ill people are prone to addictions. They can't control their behavior. They behave erratically and also impulsively. So within this framework, one might imagine the pilot possibly feeling tempted in a very simple way, he wants to make all the noise and chatter go away. He just wants relief. And he can achieve that by flicking a switch. Within a very narrow interpretation of reality, this crazy behavior, seems to make sense. According to one study, the causes of crime are constructed by the offenders themselves, and the causes they construct are lures and pressures that they experience as independently moving them toward crime. In other words, in their own self-made schemas, they develop frameworks and fantasies essentially to cope with their dilemmas. Some of them are partially fictitious. In this fragmenting schema, real action becomes increasingly interchangeable with unreality. So when they take drastic action, it doesn't necessarily seem real to them. And a lot of what is taking place here is a dialectical process, which is a method of reasoning. It's an argument that someone is having with themselves. There's this back and forth exchange, but inside a person's head on what is going on in their heart in a way. And this seductive process, this whole process where this person is losing touch with reality, it's a kind of internal storytelling which kind of gets out of hand. That's why you need to get someone else's second opinion on where you're going with this, and it often pulls the offender towards certain lines of action that they have unconsciously conceptualized and set into motion. And so through this process of storytelling, there's a constant immersion in self-definition, often negative, and somewhere along the line it shifts towards a darker and more sinister place. According to this paper, it posits a theory combining three principal predisposers: low social capital or social death, associated with being marginalized or simply isolated within a community, and then an impaired psyche. This is important. An impaired psyche that frames this marginalization as a reflection of a biased and unjust system, in other words, delusional psychosis, and the resultant pariah self-image, which is the overall depression and mental illness. You can't have any of this with a high sense of self-esteem. This is predisposed on losing your sense of self. So there may be feelings of anger, rage, even humiliation that motivate one to a sense of violence that acts in a self-serving sacrifice to a skewed morality. Each shooter, in this case mass murderer, embraced a powerful rationale that sought to undermine the system that denied them access to the status that they rightfully deserved. In this regard, the motivation for public mass murder, this is truly terrifying, can be said to be universal. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I am going to leave you with this question.
So at the end of the day, we have to trust the individuals who are at the pointy end of these airliners. And that leads us to kind of the inscrutable area of the human mind. And it's for aviation people, it's more about psychology, whereas we're more accustomed to dealing with changing procedures.
What do you think about this difficult subject? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys next time.